who are here with us, and a warm welcome for this webinar on identifying and developing top talent. I will, of course, come to the specific objectives of the webinar in a moment, but the one that I'm especially keen on is that we want to move the whole, the narrative and the objective of identifying and developing talent away from the platitudes that it sometimes gets lowered to. So the idea is to really bring in some incisive views, views that should be deployed, that should be curated to the organization's needs, and also the ways in which these can be done. And I have the pleasure of having Mr. Dhruv Prakash and Ms. Neeta Mola on the webinar, who will be sharing their deep and wide expertise on this area, and which is based on very, very deep experience that both of them have. So Mr. Prakash, I think a lot of you would probably already know both of them, but just so that everybody knows a little bit about them. So Mr. Prakash has been a leadership consultant and a coach for many years now. His insight into leaders and talent is especially useful because he's had a view to leaders as a board member himself. He's been the MD for Korn Ferry in India, so has worked with top leadership teams on strategic issues like talent identification and development. He's also been a practice leader with Hewitt Associates. Mrs. Mola is a director at InspireOne, and her expertise comes from her very deep insights into emotional intelligence. And I think she's probably, one of the leading consultants in the EI space who's actually been able to help leaders apply EI in their roles and see the impact of that. And she also, of course, has more than 3 decades of experience in this area. So we're looking forward greatly to their experience-based considered views on this area. I'm Suman Sethi. I've been with InspireOne for many, many years now and have worked extensively, again, in the space of leadership assessments and development. So by virtue of being with a company like InspireOne, I think the advantage one has is an insight into different types of organizations, different types of strategies that they are working towards, and so therefore the different types of talent that they may need, because top talent also will mean different things for different organizations. So that's been an interesting observation for me as a consultant, and we are very happy to be sharing thoughts, views, and also would be very happy to get your thoughts and views. Would encourage all of you to use the chat box generously and put down your thoughts and your questions throughout the webinar. And we do have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, and we'll be really happy to take up all those questions and also the views that you may share. So without more of the context setting, let me just move on. The format of the webinar will be to cover basically all dimensions of top talent identification and development. But even before that, really getting the panelists' views on what is top talent or who is top talent, because I think the biggest disservice that is done to organizations and talent is when we don't very mindfully and intentionally define what talent means for that particular organization. So we will be addressing that first and foremost. We'll go into then talking about, so therefore, what are the competencies that are required in this environment and tomorrow's environment. We'll then briefly touch upon, what is the best way of assessing those requirements, because a lot of them are also competencies that probably haven't been assessed for later. Earlier. They may exist with leaders, but probably we don't have the experience of how to assess for them. So we'll be talking about that, and then finally close with some best practices on development for top talent. So those are the broad objectives, and I don't want to preach to the choir, but I just want to stress upon one point that is non-negotiable anymore. I think top talent or work with top talent has for a lot of organizations, for a long time has been the agenda of the talent teams. And rightly so, they are, they are the facilitators and enablers for talent to be identified and developed. However, along with that, it has to non-negotiably move to the agenda of the business leaders, because the impact that we are looking at now is strategic. We are looking at sustainable impact, and we are looking at the impact not being limited to one set of top talent that is identified at one point in time. It needs to be a fluid, ongoing process. And also, like I said, the focus on identifying areas that people may or may not have had the opportunity to display, but more importantly, knowing ways or developing ways of assessment where we can help assess those competencies at whatever level leaders may have delivered on them earlier. So the imperative, I think, is very clear to everyone, and the one point we want to focus on is that it is strategic. So I'll start with the first, the first piece on the for the webinar, or the first objective, and I'd like Mr. Prakash and then also, of course, Ms. Mola to share their thoughts and views on, how would we define top talent today? Is it different from what top talent looked like maybe, a couple of years or a few years back? Who are we actually looking for when we say top talent? Are these people who are already great performers, or are there other dimensions to it? And then also along with that, Mr. Prakash, if you could also talk about, what are they being expected to deliver on now? Is that visual very clear, and, do we know what they should be working towards, developing towards? So I'll just invite you for your thoughts and views on this.
Thank you, Suman, and good morning to all the participants. I'm really happy to be participating in this webinar on a topic which I think it's an evergreen topic, but it just keeps getting greener as the world becomes more and more complex. So to your question of how do we define top talent today, my first point is that I don't know if you should, if using the word top is really the best description, because this is not a contest. It's not about getting your 30 below 30 or 40 below 40 list none, but it is a question of having the organization populated with people who will drive the agenda, take it forward, help it move through all the turbulence that the environment provides, and not only move through the turbulence, but find opportunities in that. So I'm sorry to be talking in such broad terms, but the fact of the matter is that because of the VUCA-ness of the world increasing every day, the definition of top talent continues to become less crystallized, less solidified, and more fluid. So as long as we keep in focus what the objective of ensuring that there is sufficient resources in terms of talent available in the organization to ensure continuous success, that should be sufficient. And I think the second big change that has happened, over time, in the definition of top talent, when succession planning and top talent management started in the early days, the organizations are fairly simple, pyramidal. There were very few turbulences in the business environment and so on and so forth. However, a lot of that has changed. So, and what it seems like now is that there are two clear streams of talent that an organization needs for continuous success. One is a set of talent that will navigate the organization through all sorts of circumstances, will continually ensure success. And then there is another set of talent, which is a deep technical talent, which is becoming more and more strategically crucial. So unless you are on top of technology today, technology about your product, technology as in information technology, you are likely to miss opportunities, and you are likely to get overtaken by competitors who you never thought were competitors. So things like that. So I think therefore there has to be a dual pillar of talent development, and the focus of that has to be to keep the organization continuously in play, no matter how the environment changes. And that is the expectation that the top talent is expected to deliver on.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Prakash. I'll just synopsize this in a moment. Just request Mrs. Mola also to add her views on this.
Yeah, thank you, Suman. And again, good morning to everybody. So I'm just going to build upon what, Dhruv has just sort of mentioned, because it was so simple in the earlier days. We had something like 9-box model, and we would say, okay, performance on one side, potential on one side. And we never knew how to really measure potential very clearly, but there were some guidelines and we could work with that. But today we're asking this question, of course, multiple types of questions, but one important question is, what do we want the high potential to really, to really deliver? So a high potential may not only be the erstwhile person who could take higher leadership roles, for example. Your talent could also be somebody who's, like Dhruv mentioned, somebody who's very technically strong in a particular space, and which is very crucial to what you really deliver. Your talent may not be only the person, and quite likely the person who's performed well in the past. So you have to look ahead and define what are those skills, competencies, that are really going to help you navigate in the future as you see it, and which is also going to be very agile. So in today's context, I think the definition of talent itself has really broadened. According to me, it is widened and broadened to include many categories, and to know more clearly what is it that we really would need to do in order to be successful as an organization, as opposed to just saying that, okay, we need, of course we do need a leadership pipeline. So that is one kind of talent, but it's not just limited to that. So it's interesting how we now customize a lot more instruments that were available. I mean, I would still say 9-box model is fine, but you need to look a little bit, I feel we need to look a little bit beyond that to be more specific to our business needs, to the environment, to our people, and so on. So it's interesting for, at least for me, to see how talent is also being defined in a more, or should be defined according to me, in a more broad-based way. And what is it that the top talent is expected to deliver on is a great question. I think that, organizations will need to also ask of themselves. So while we can, talk about it in a generic way that yes, they have to deliver on changing environments, on being flexible, on being able to manage talent, being ahead of the talent of competition, all of that. But I think this question will also become more specific to every organization as we go along. So it has to be answered by them as well as by everybody. So that's my take on this first part.
Right. Thank you both for this. So what I really understand from what both of you said is 2 or 3 things. The first one being that talent is no longer a very commoditized, we can't commoditize the definition of talent. It means very specific things for specific organizations, depending on what the organization's strategy is. So one is that it needs to be curated to that. The other part of talent that both of you alluded to also was that they need to have certain capabilities or certain skills to deal with the turbulent environment. So that's a given. That's something that's standard for all kinds of talent. The third thing that you also said was that talent is no longer, a certain set of people that we are looking at, but it is about an organization being able to, identify and develop sufficient resources that will help the organization to be continuously in play, as Mr. Prakash mentioned. So it's, and in that sense, I think what Mrs. Mola was also saying is similar, that it's a wider and a deeper definition now, and not just restricted to succession planning, etc. I think we also spoke about the fact that it's no longer pyramidical, since the organization's needs are not only unidimensional. We are therefore looking at two types of talent. One is the talent that has the capability and the capacity to navigate through the uncertain times, and the other talent we're looking at is deeply technical talent, deep technology experts who can then leverage and be the first movers in those areas. So basically, therefore, what we are saying is that so therefore the potential that we are looking at, or what we are looking at in terms of the talent, is that they must have the capacity, so some amount of capability, big preference, and the desire to develop on skills that will be needed. So one is, of course, that there will be some constant skills that we need, but since times are changing, turbulent, requirements are different, then one of the main definitions of potential will be, how willing, capable, and oriented are people to develop themselves on whatever is required. And what we are looking at, like Mr. Prakash mentioned, is that the talent should be able to perform to the specific strategy of the organization. I'd just like to add to this this dimension based on the work that we have done, especially with organizations in the last 2 or 3 years, where we've looked at identifying talent and helping organizations to develop. I think one of the things that we were very careful about and very guarded about is that, with this whole big change happening, especially in the last 2 years, we somehow get carried away with the narrative of, the new normal and tomorrow's leaders and so on. The focus becomes so much on the new and the different and tomorrow that we sometimes obliterate, the basic foundational dimensions that are still true of talent. And it's important, therefore, that when we are making our, our identifiers of talent or potential, we need to be looking at all three. We need to create a balance of all three. Some of the foundational dimensions that will stay true forever, the core, as we call it. The growth dimensions, which will be more around the learnability, the agility, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the career dimensions, which I also think are very, very important, because, when we are saying career dimensions, we are largely also meaning a person's own achievement orientation, because if the person is not excited about growth for themselves, then growth in the wider context also will not hold too much meaning for them. So whereas we want people to be very committed as a collective to the organization, but that achievement orientation also needs to reflect through how they want to build their own careers, what are the insights that they have on that. So therefore, if I just summarize, I think what everyone is really been talking about, we're looking at, people feeling talent. Talent will be people who feel accountable for the entire company's success, whether it's through their technological expertise or their ability to navigate. It would be people who are quick to respond, and yet being very intentional in their responses, yet being sure of, what is the impact that those responses will have. We need people who can work as a collective, because if there's no longer a pyramid, there needs to be, people with very specific competencies, but not being able to, work on those competencies unless they are working together. And of course, people being very open to being challenged, and that's the element of growth. So we'll just move on now to I'll just like to invite both of them on their views on So, that's an overarching definition of talent and potential and what organizations should be looking at vis-a-vis what they were looking at earlier. If you could just talk about, the specific competencies, how would you then break these down into specific competencies, which actually then is easier for organizations to assess and develop on? So, Ms. Mola, if you'd like to start with your views.
So, Suman, in some respects, you've provided the framework. So I think there are the core competencies that still become very important. So can you think through issues? Can you break down complex issues? Can you think strategically, problem solve, think flexibly? So all those competencies they are still relevant. Can you inspire your team? Can you build relationships? The execution, the ability to collaborate. So some of that becomes is your foundational core, and they're still equally equally important and relevant. But I think sitting on top of all of that, and I know this is a pet subject for Dhruv, so I'm really going to not talk about it too much, Dhruv. I'm going to let you talk about this. Is the ability to be a constant and a voracious learner. Because of dynamic times, if you're not curious and you don't want to learn, or you feel you know it all, or you want to come from a paradigm of your past, that'll be a disaster. So this learning agility or learnability, or call it what you may, becomes very important and crucial. Then, of course, COVID, of course, has taught us, and I think this term hero was kind of coined during COVID times, where we talked about leaders who could build hope and optimism, and more importantly, were very resilient. So this ability to bounce back and the ability to be constantly adaptive, I think resilience is a little bit more than just being adaptive. It's how quickly you're able to come back and still look forward and see new opportunities, see new changes. All of that becomes, and be greatly positive about it, is really the core. So I think that is something that is becoming, or has become, very critical and important. I'd like to just spend a minute also on collaboration, because I've seen the way this competency has sort of changed complexion over a period of time, and it comes in different shapes and forms. But intrinsically, it's not just about cooperation and getting people together. It's a lot more about being able to build on diversity. And of course, again, now inclusion can be a part of it, and is a part of it, but it is of a much more of a higher order competency than what it was in the past. So the ability to feel absolutely comfortable engaging and inviting diverse views, and then being able to synthesize them into a common objective and common goal, and really move ahead with that. So collaboration today is so important, because while the list of competencies seems to be increasing, it's impossible to have anybody demonstrate all these competencies to a certain level. So invariably, we'll need to have people who are good in different areas but can collaborate together. In fact, good at diverse areas and can collaborate together. So I think collaboration, to that extent, is become very, very important and critical, and how that really plays out, and how people are able to really work with their own egos, and be able to really be all the time open to diverse views, is, in my mind, a complex competency that is absolutely important in times ahead. I mean, that's my list. And of course, you talked about energy, you talked about motivation. So yeah, what is going to be even more critical is how we manage ourselves, the emotional intelligence part of it. And more so, because the more we can manage ourselves and regulate ourselves, the more we'll be able to have, positive energy, of course, and the more we'll be able to utilize our existing competencies better. So that's my list, Suman. I don't want to increase it, because then it sounds like, gosh, we need these perfect people, and nobody can match up to that ever. But Dhruv, I'd like you to be able to sort of say what you think about this.
Thank you. I think you've covered it all. But like you were saying, I am a great believer that organizations today, more than ever, need learning agile people. If you don't have the ability in the organization to be constantly in touch with what's going on in the world, in, areas unrelated to yourself, and take meaning out of that and apply it to yourself, it'll be hard for you to stay ahead of competition, or you'd be missing many opportunities. Similarly, change is happening so quickly that you don't have the ability to set a change management process in place. So if you do not have the ability to be change agile, to adapt to change yourself and lead other people into the change. If you don't have there's so much emphasis on diversity, on issues like environment. There is so much new regulation that is coming up that if you do not have the ability to synthesize all of that and translate that into what it means for your business and how can you do well under those circumstances. Particularly, look at the dimension of diversity. Now, by regulation, you're expected to become more diverse at the board and your top management, in your organization, and so on and so forth. So if you don't have the agility to work with different types of people, then the organization will break down. Similarly, I said that there is deep technical knowledge that is required. But if the organization does not have the agility to assimilate highly technical people into their systems of management, the organization will fail. So I think all the dimensions of learning agilities are something that the organization needs to focus on and ensure that it keeps developing. And there is the other thing about there's this law of thermodynamics which says entropy keeps growing in the universe, right? And the only organizations, only systems that survive are systems which can exchange entropy for energy. So if you have to keep throwing out entropy and keep restocking your organization with energy, you need agile people. You need open windows. You need people who can deal with open windows. So I think that is going to be a very critical dimension.
Right. Thanks both. So therefore, what we are really saying is 2 or 3 key things over here. And I'll just, again, try and put them all together. So one, of course, Mr. Prakash, you spoke about learnability and its, its absolute and complete importance or imperative in organizations. And you, of course, spoke also about learnability in different ways. So one is, of course, learnability in terms of being agile to respond, but also learnability in terms of being able to accept diversity and respond to it. And I think what you said about it being regulated now is very critical, because one of the things that we notice in a lot of organizations, again, is the fact that they will probably try and meet the regulation bit of diversity and ensure the right gender balance, or at least work towards it, or the right kind of balance in other aspects of diversity also. But what we do find is that with a lot of leaders, it still hasn't found acceptability within themselves. They still are not seeing the actual benefit of it. And I think that makes a lot of difference between talent would be people who actually believe that that can add value, and the others may just still be just little tentative about how much they're learning through there. And I think one other point that you raised was also important, and I think Ms. Mola also alluded to that, was the fact that we don't have the time or the luxury to put in place change management systems every time there is a change, because then we are working more from the prescriptive side. We are still working from the assumption that people are not comfortable with change. And so therefore these processes need to be put in place, and we don't yet have the time to do it. So interestingly, we are looking at a paradigm shift where we are saying people just have to be able to deal with change themselves without any support of change management programs. It's just the hygiene that is required from talent today. There was this, I think, the piece that Ms. Mola, you spoke about in terms of, being able to work as a collective and it not being just restricted to being collaborative. And the point that you made there is very critical, that, there is so much required of talent today that it's impossible that one person or two people will have all of it. So there's this analogy, I don't think it's the prettiest analogy, but something I was reading some time back said that each talent or each leader is like an indispensable organ, but is only successful if all organs are, working collectively. They all have their roles and they're indispensable, but they may not be very useful unless they're working as a collective. I think the third area that you spoke about was resilience, and also the broader and the deeper meaning of resilience, not just about, being able to be positive in a scenario, but also to be able to respond to the scenario without creating a lot of, doomsday kind of an environment for people around you. And interestingly, we are in the process of doing this work on resilience and agility with a large organization, which is, into many products. It's a large Indian group who were wanting to kind of assess their preparedness in terms of resilience and agility. And what we found is, what we are still working with is very interesting, is that when we spoke to leaders, we found out that they actually tick all the boxes in terms of what resilience means, in terms of not taking very negative actions or not taking very harsh actions when trouble strikes or change happens, but being able to take a calm, intentional view of what needs to continue, how they shouldn't be creating this panic in the system and, making everybody focus on costs and stuff like that. So they're able to create, deal with things with a calm when they happen. Two, they're also constantly looking at ways in which, they can grow or change or, transform. And three, they're investing in the right places. So they're not just doing, paperwork, they're also putting in investments where they need to happen. So they kind of ticked all the boxes at the leadership level, but very interestingly, that hasn't yet trickled down to the rest of the organization. So even leaders at, the second level, and then of course, everybody, all talent going down the company, isn't yet able to work with those, with those characteristics, isn't yet enabled to work with those characteristics. So that was very interesting also, that, there may be organizations who are doing a really good job of it at the absolute top, but they haven't probably been able to build enough resources that are resilient and energetic, or talent that is resilient and energetic or agile at different levels. So that's interesting. And I think that could be another thing that organizations do look at. And then, of course, Ms. Mola, you spoke a lot about, the confidence, the self-awareness, letting go of the ego, being able to look at how we can, adapt the optimism, group orientation, and so on and so forth. So I think that kind of really puts a concrete framework also to what are the competencies. Now, moving on to the very critical part of, a lot of these competencies haven't been assessed for in the past. So what do you believe would be, what do you believe are the suggested ways of also assessing for these competencies?
So I'll just give a brief structure to how we look at them at Inspire1, Dhruv, and I'd really like you to expand on what your experience has been. What we've realized is that, when we've looked at assessments, and I think that's the big part of development, because when you know what a person is inherently, and you know what a person is good at, and you're able to clearly use a lot of data and analytics to really define where a person's motivations are, where they're good at, and who the person is, and put it together, you're able to sort of give the person an opportunity to work with their strengths and to be able to challenge them to do their best in where all these three aspects meet. So our assessment process has therefore moved from we also started with looking at just one type of assessment, where we typically actually started with emotional intelligence, and then we looked at certain other personality tools, and then we went on to looking at capability measurements as well, to now looking at really a very holistic way of assessing a person and using as much data. And of course, one part is gathering and putting that data together. The second part is the analysis of that data and how predictive we can be using that data through creation of this model. So our model looks at two aspects. The first aspect is what we call the preference, which is really the hardwired part of who we are, our orientations, values, our motivations, things that get developed at an early age typically. So whether we are introverted, extroverted is one example, and so on. And of course, none of this is good or bad, but we need to know where, what a person inherently is, or who the person inherently is. And then we look at, all right, through different, experiences, what are those competencies that the person has already developed, and at what level. We are also able to therefore then look at behaviors and competencies that the person is so has developed one and can develop, because when we extrapolate the data of the preference and capability, so I'll just take an example. Let's say a person has a preference of enjoying influencing others, right? But the capability hasn't got developed. Now, this can therefore be an area for us, and if the motivation and the career aspiration is also in line, is a huge opportunity for us to develop the competence in that area so that the person can be more successful. So typically we look at preferences, we look at capability, we look at in some cases also emotional intelligence, because certain roles really need that. And then we create this, we put all the data together to really create this holistic whole person kind of a profile. And using this profile, or having this profile in place, helps us then to be able to chart the course for each person, maybe a little differently, maybe separately, maybe role wise, maybe level wise, or leadership complexity wise, and then really look at how do we then develop the person accordingly. So here on the right hand side is a little bit of a model explaining what is preference and capability. I haven't gone into that, but looking at capability, we're looking at all the skills that a person has acquired through the different roles and challenges that they faced. So I'll give you one interesting example here. So we worked with a certain level of leaders, but we also contrasted leaders who had worked in, let's say, a manufacturing kind of a setup versus leaders that had worked in a more IT service kind of a setup. And what we found very interestingly is that while both, so the preferences were what they were, that was one part of it, but people who were from the IT services background, or who had worked in that sort of area, had developed a lot more competencies simply because they'd had the opportunities of working in global environments, constantly shifting and changing, working with multiple clients. So again, it gave us very good insights into having a particular preference, but also how do we develop the capability in line with the preference and in line with where a person's motivation is, in order to tap the maximum potential of different people. So that is what we in Inspire One use, which is, again, I'd like to just quickly summarize this. These are different types of tools. Our objective is to gather extensive data, or as much data. So of course we have data from the organization about performance, but we also look at all these assessments to be able to determine what are the key aspects of personality that can be very helpful. And currently now, of course, our personality tools have also started, they've been modernized to include neuroscience research as well. Then, of course, we look at, evidence-based tools to gather the level of competency the person has developed in different types of areas. And here again, I'd like to just state that what has become very critical is that we don't just look at those situations that were existing or that were relevant, or in the 90s. A lot of tools have situations that were important, say in the 90s, or were developed in the 90s, but we have to have situations that people face currently, and that's what we've attempted to do, to create situations that are more relevant or that are going to come up in the future, and build in the complexities in those situations, and then look at how do we really assess competencies. So yes, so there is the personality, there are these competencies, there is emotional intelligence, there's past performance. So a lot of data that can be gathered, and then of course how we really use analytics to really define where core strengths lie, and what could be career paths, and what the development course could be thereon. So that's a little bit about what we're doing in Inspire One. But Dhruv, what will be very helpful is for you to give your perspective on this as well.
This is a great framework. My bias, however, is for the assessment to be an everyday exercise. You cannot do once in a while assessment, which is done by some set of expert assessors. It's a helpful input, but it is not a great help in development. And why I'm saying that is this: that the best development happens when you are getting feedback and the developmental input as things happen. And the second thing is that the problem with most assessment and development frameworks is that they are unidirectional. So there is a developer and there is a developee. There is an assessor and there is an assessee. This to my mind is inefficient, because there is an opportunity for the developer also to get developed in the process of providing development inputs. Yeah. There is an opportunity for the assessor to open their own mind about themselves and become more self-aware in the process of assessing somebody else. And that can set in motion a virtuous cycle of assessment and development, or feedback and feed forward and so on and so forth. Right? So while this is absolutely necessary, I'm not saying that this is not required, but having done this, you have to translate this into an everyday activity, into a transaction by transaction activity, where consciously or subliminally both sides are interacting on the assessment and development piece. They are getting inputs for development, they are becoming more self-aware, they are sometimes you get direct harsh feedback, sometimes you get subtle directions, sometimes you get feedback or developmental input which is not given as feedback, and it just happens in conversation, right? So all of that should become a necessary part of the assessment and development framework. That is when it becomes most effective.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think to your point, Dhruv, that when an organization focuses on learning agility, then, if that is in place, all this becomes so much easier, to create a kind of an ecosystem where learning and development is not restricted to an event, but it is ongoing in everyday behavior, in every interaction, or in most interactions, can be so valuable. It can be such a great opportunity. Is the best opportunity actually for development.
Yeah, and you will see a sea change in the type of talent council meetings that you have. Typically do the 9-box analysis, like you were saying, Neeta. When they, there is this situation where they're saying, okay, you give me the assessment data. and I will superimpose on it what my impression of that person is, right? So they're using, overall impression. There is the recency effect, and then they're challenging the assessment data, agreeing with it, not agreeing with it, and so on and so forth. But when their managers come with this experience of everyday interactive learning and assessment and development, the quality of discussion is completely different,
Absolutely.
and it's far more purposeful and far less judgmental.
No, absolutely. I think it's like, fitting in the pieces of the jigsaw together. And so what I'm just, also gleaning from what both of you said is the part of, the part that Ms. Muller you spoke about, which is the whole person. So we're not just looking at, the capabilities that have happened, but we're also looking at the natural preference of the person, which is coming through these psychometrics. And in fact, interestingly, the psychometric tools that, some of the ones that we are using have interestingly also been agile and have also learned from the neuroscience research that has been, quite extensive in the past decade and a half. So we are happy that the assessment tools are also, learning and responding. And they're talking a lot about, when we are saying neuroscience, we're saying things like, how serotonin and dopamine impacts, people's behaviors, and then how that translates into performance, etc. So there is a deeper level of, not just a personality trait, but also ongoing, things that may not be as stable, in personalities as they were thought to be. So that's an interesting piece that has come up. And I think the third thing that you spoke about is also the opportunities that people have had in the past to be able to display certain behaviors and competencies or develop on them. So those are the areas that we are saying that we need to be able to assess people on as a whole person. And I think, Mr. Prakash, what you were talking about is that these shouldn't be event-based, but they should be more ongoing, ways of assessing people. And they shouldn't also be unidirectional, but the developer and the assessor also should be agile and learning and, be able to bring that to bear and shouldn't come with a fixed mindset. And that is, of course, very critical and has huge benefit, for the sustainability of it. But I do also feel that it's like it's something that will take a lot of time, because we all also know that on the ground there is just so much that people are dealing with and grappling with, that to build this kind of a mindset of ongoing feedback, openness to playing both roles, etc., is something that will take sustained effort. And in the meantime, organizations are also looking at
Suman,
yes.
if I
Yes.
interrupt, I disagree with that. I think people are already spending that much time, but they're spending that time in assessments, in the performance evaluations. So if you distribute that time in your everyday interaction, your time taken for the periodical assessments and performance
Will be lower.
conversations
No,
will
absolutely.
reduce and
Yeah.
become more meaningful and will become
Yeah.
less of a conflict.
No,
And
absolutely.
you would have, created a platform anyway for
Yeah.
that conversation. So I don't think there is any extra time that is required.
No, I wasn't meaning in
It is the
terms.
same
Yeah.
same time that you need to distribute more purposefully.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that, Mr. Prakash. I wasn't talking about more time that is required. I was talking about this shifting from doing it at some times to doing it all the time. That shift itself requires people to make a move. So not so
Yes,
much in
absolutely.
terms of the time,
That is a big
but
change.
the shift will require some time and effort to make over there. So so that's good to know about the assessments and what's changing there. And there are 2 or 3 questions that have already come up, and we'll just take them in a moment. Thank you for the questions. Those of you who've already put them there, and for the others, I'll just request you to please do put your questions there. Jay, I can see your hand is raised. Unfortunately, we won't be able to work on the unmuting piece. Can we just request you to put the question in the chat. Thank you. So, so I know we are coming to the end of the time that we had set for this. Would just like to take a couple of minutes on the development best practices, because I think a lot of those have already been covered by what Mr. Prakash and Ms. Mola had also mentioned. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to synopsize that, and then we'll take on the question answers immediately after that. So I think one of the things that everybody spoke about was the fact that learning, like assessments, has to be more curated. Learning has to be looked at differently in terms of it can't, it needs to bring into, and that's the responsibility of the people who are creating those learning programs, is that it at one end it will have common themes that talent needs to be developed on. The outcome of the program should be that the talent is developed to whatever competencies that we are wanting them to display. It also needs to be curated to specific requirements of talent or of leaders. So that's what we're looking at in terms of coaching. And one of the things that Mr. Prakash had mentioned when we were discussing this earlier, which is, I think, hugely critical, and which is also something that is being done to an extent by some organizations, is that experience, the experiential learning part of it cannot be something that we expect should come to bear only after all the development has happened. In fact, experiential learning is a core part of the entire development process. And so therefore it must start right at the beginning, and it must be aligned to stretch roles, goals, projects, but all of which are aligned to what the organization priorities are. So they cannot just be based on, what the person is doing currently. They must be connected directly to the organization priorities. So broadly, the elements that we look at in development is assessment also being part of the development, and development plans that have common themes, that have specific areas for leaders, experiential learning that emanates right at the beginning of the whole program. Then, of course, there are, the workshops, etc., that need to be also delivered. Group coaching, which is the peer learning, is becoming an immensely useful part of all these development programs. And I think, Mr. Prakash, to your point that, learning is not unidimensional or unidirectional. It needs to be coming from the entire environment to each other. And, developers can't just be consultants from outside or coaches or mentors from inside. They will also be your peers to a very large extent. And then, of course, there are different types of immersions where you're also getting broader horizons through other leaders, other best practices, going to the field, etc. So development programs, as we see them emerging, already organizations working on them, and also the future of it, will need to have, some of these elements as core and fundamental, and some maybe, added on for the specific requirement of, of that organization and the people there. So those were some of the things on, the development best practices that we wanted.
Well, if I can take a few
Yes.
seconds,
Yes,
I
of
wanted to
course.
add something.
Hmm.
And that is that my experience is that the development programs don't pay attention to development of intelligence. In today's complex environment, you need raw intelligence to be able to solve many of the issues, right?
Right.
And everyone knows that we use a very small fraction of our brain power. So if you create training programs where you train people to use more of the IQ they have, you don't, I mean, there is a deficit of talent, right? In any case, there is a deficit. But if you can make people use their intelligence more effectively and bring that to bear on business problems,
Right.
the organization's ability to do better than everyone else will significantly increase. And I haven't seen much of that happening in training programs.
That's true. That is actually true, and seems like something that should be, considered a core now of development programs for talent.
I think so, because it's a huge waste.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. We'll just take up the questions now. And there are a couple of questions that are linked. So if you'll allow me, I'll just answer those and then I'll, open up the rest of the questions to both of you. So there are a couple of questions that say that, can these assessments be contextualized basis the competency models of the organization? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, there's significant work that is happening over there. And especially in terms of, the situation-based assessments that happen, or, the assessment centers that happen. There is significant work that is happening to develop scenarios which are very, tied into the competencies that the organization has zoned in all, and also contextualized to the actual complexities that leaders in, or talent in that organization will need to address, whether they need to address those in their current roles or one role above or two roles above. But absolutely they can be, and they are being contextualized greatly. There's also a related question on seeing the effectiveness of the 360-degree as a development input. So the view is that as long as the 360-degree is also customized to what is now needed by that organization. So customized in terms of, what are you asking feedback for? What are the questions? What do you really want to get out of, about a person? They are effective. But one of the things about 360-degree surveys that remains, unchanged from before, and that's not something that's just specific for now or for the future, is the prevailing environment in the organization. So how open are people to giving the right feedback, and how open are people to accepting it? So, the psychological safety part of it, and, are people, is the environment such that feedback is encouraged and authentic feedback is encouraged, then a 360-degree survey is very effective. However, if that is not the prevailing environment, then that can probably be a waste of effort and maybe create more problems than situations.
May I come in on this one?
Yes.
This is a favorite of mine. I think this is one instrument which is very, very useful in multiple ways, but it is not used effectively for two reasons. And apart from everything else that you said, one is that there is, it's used mechanically. These are the three sections. Your rating on performance is good. Your rating on strategic thinking is bad. Your rating on people, it's like that. A 360-degree should always be analyzed for patterns, not for individual responses. You look for patterns, and those patterns tell you what the core area of development is.
Correct. Yeah.
And
no, absolutely.
And there is need for someone to debrief the 360 degrees. You cannot leave the results of 360 degrees to the assessee and ask them to make the best
interpret it. Yeah, absolutely.
Because
no, totally agree.
Most often what happens is that they get happy about something and sad about something else and forget it.
Yeah. No,
it
true. Absolutely.
Lead to development.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think those are core things that need to be kept in mind. I know that we are coming on top of the hour and there are still 3 or 4 questions to be answered. I'll take one right now. I'll request Mrs. Mola to respond to that. And the others, we will, immediately today get back on those via email, and we can set up a call also with you. So the last question that I wanted, to take on was by Jay. So Jay is saying, when we speak about resilience, agility, and collaboration, how should one approach developing these? Because developing may not be as simple as it sounds. So we may still be able to assess them, but the development may be a little difficult. So he needs a couple of thoughts on that. So if I may request Mrs. Mola to answer.
So I'll have to answer it in a little simplistic way because of time, but I think the first part, especially when we're talking about things like resilience, which is an internal response to a certain situation largely, I think the awareness of how this comes about, why is it high, why is it low, itself is a very important part of development. So how to build resilience comes later, but if we really understand ourselves with respect to this particular trait, if you like, or competency, whatever way you want to define it, uh, helps you to sort of, so I think self-reflection and understanding the competence and where you stand on it itself is a very critical part, or the first main part of this. Then I think that how you experience it in situations becomes an important element of developing it. So whether you can simulate those situations or use coaching to really develop some of these competencies, where a person experiences these competencies in different situations and is able to then understand what did the person do and what can they do about it differently, could be another way of really looking at developing it. And of course, what ultimately you have to give them small tools to be able to work on how to think differently about it or how to act differently about it, could be the third element. So I'm just summarizing, Jay, and for everybody else's understanding in a simplistic way. I think the first important part is deep understanding of the competence and where a person stands on it. The second could be really looking at multiple situations. For example, in collaboration, if you're looking at how do you really develop it, besides understanding how good I am or not so good I am, it's really about creating these diverse, groups and helping people to navigate through those groups, and then observing them, giving them feedback and telling them what they could do differently. And that is why I think some of these things are really done, not just in simulated situations, but more on an ongoing day-to-day basis. And I think that data that you capture in that and use that to help a person understand and develop could be very useful. But yes, you do need to also have, in your repertoire, some tools that you can quickly also give to people, so that they can sort of, in the short term, before they they really change, use these tools to be able to think differently or act differently.
No, and I think that the mechanisms, the more powerful mechanisms for developing resilience and collaboration and agility could be peer coaching and coaching, along with, what Mr. Prakash had mentioned about the ongoing feedback and developmental input. Great, thank you for
Action
the
learning
questions
programs.
as well
Sorry,
as.
Suman, just adding that action learning programs
Would be
mindfully applied.
Yeah,
This is a very big qualification.
mindfully. Yes.
Is really very good for agility and collaboration.
Correct. No, that's true. Great. So thank you all for your questions and the panelists for the answers. Prajakta, I think you have a great question there, and which goes into the next, thing that needs to be done strategically with talent is how can we retain this talent? So after we've found them, we've developed their resources, their capabilities, etc. What do we do to retain them? I think I have the idea that the next webinar that we do should be on this area, because this is wide and deep and I'm sure of interest to all of us. So thank you for that, that thought and that question. We'll of course respond to you separately offline on it. But you, I think, have given us the idea for the next webinar also. So thank you for that, and would like to, bring this webinar to a close, because I know we are over time and everybody has other things to go back to. But just very quickly, thank you all very much for being part of this, for being inquisitive and wanting to know more. So thank you for your time and your thoughts here. And thank you, Mr. Prakash and Ms. Mola, for your time as well and your inputs. I'm sure everyone would have found one piece at least that they can take back and apply in some way or the other. So thank you all very much. Have a great Friday and a great weekend ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.